She kneeled on a low scaffold while a foreign sword glinted in the sun. The blade came down clean and practiced. The head lifted, shown to the crowd, then tucked into an arrow chest as if it were a trophy instead of a human being. The crowd whooped. Jewels were stripped, insignia removed, the woman's hair rumpled, her face shrouded for a final instant, and the entire performance read less like justice than like theater designed to humiliate, sexualize, and erase. This was Anne Boleyn's death, and it was not an isolated event. It was a decisive act in a campaign that used sex, rumor, and spectacle as instruments of statecraft. Across the Tower's courts and the king's antechambers, a set of methods repeated, building on one another until they formed a system. Call them crimes, not merely political maneuvers. 5 distinct sexual crimes engineered by Henry VIII's regime to destroy women who stood in the way of dynastic aims, to weaponize sexual morality for public punishment, and to erase memory itself. If this subject matters to you, stay with me. And if you want more deep dives like this, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Crime 1. Fabricating sexual accusations as political murder. Imagine being accused of the most intimate violations not because there is evidence, but because those accusations will do a job. That was the first crime. The deliberate fabrication of sexual charges. Adultery, incest, sexual depravity, used as legal cover to remove a political obstacle. These were not private whispers alone. They were dossiers designed to convince a court and an audience that a woman's sexual behavior endangered the realm. The anecdote is brutal in its procedural clarity. Anne Boleyn was charged alongside 5 men, lords and gentlemen, alleged to have been her lovers or, in one instance, to have been complicit in incest. Men were arrested, interrogated, and in some cases, executed before her. The prosecution assembled a pattern, a mosaic of impropriety, constructed out of forced confessions, coerced testimonies, and rumor. Thomas Cromwell's machinery did not merely investigate. It constructed plausible narratives that connected reputation, rumor, and alleged sexual acts into a case that could be presented in court. Consider how the charges read as legal theater. The allegations were impossible on their face in several respects. Relationships chronologically improbable, liaison claims lodged with no witnesses of intimacy beyond hearsay. Yet the state presented them as a constellation of moral outrage, and the court accepted the geometry. That is the crime. While murderers are usually tried for violence, the state here substituted sexual shame for the burden of proof. The alleged sexual offenses became the easiest language to mobilize popular disgust and justify extreme punishment. Who benefited? The immediate beneficiary was the monarch's dynastic project. If a queen could be painted as sexually corrupt, her daughter's claim to legitimacy could be undermined. The machinery of accusation, therefore, served 2 political aims at once: remove the immediate obstacle to a new marriage, and delegitimize the offspring who might challenge succession plans. Cromwell, who orchestrated the prosecutions, provided the administrative competence to convert private rumor into prosecutable narrative. The consequence reverberated beyond those condemned. It created an atmosphere in which sexual accusation itself became a political tool, one that could be wielded against anyone who threatened the court's balance of power. The evidence of orchestration is unmistakable in the sequencing. Men arrested and tried in quick succession, testimonies extracted under pressure, and the use of a standard set of sexual charges, adultery, incest, unnatural conduct, that were designed less to describe acts than to signal moral contamination. The consequence on court culture was immediate. Retinues shrank, women were watched more closely, and the mere hint of impropriety became a weapon brandished by political rivals. To live at court after these trials was to exist under the constant threat that rumor could be translated into ruin. Crime 2. Sexualized public shaming and spectacle. A public execution is always a message.
But the second crime lies in how the spectacle itself was sexualized, in the deliberate staging that emphasized humiliation and the eroticized dimensions of shame. Anne's scaffold was not high or dignified. It was low, accessible, meant to keep her exposed to the gaze of the crowd. Jewels, insignia, and any marks of royal dignity were removed. Her hair and garments were treated as props in a ritual designed to reduce her to a sexualized object before the public eye. The sensory detail is telling. A low scaffold that denied the elevation typically accorded to a queen. A blindfold rushed on and off. A foreign swordsman summoned because the English executioner's clean work would not serve the political story. The crowd's noises, jeers, cheers, a theatrical gasp when the head was displayed, were not incidental. They were the chorus in a play crafted to reinforce the narrative of moral corruption. The removal of jewelry and royal insignia was calculated. Stripped of outward signs of status, the condemned was presented as morally stripped as well. Her public image inverted from queen to sexual outcast. This was not spontaneous mob behavior. The doubling of the garrison around the tower, the controlled access to the scaffold, and the presence of selected courtiers who would encourage the right noises turned the execution into a managed public lesson. By turning punishment into a sexualized spectacle, the court enforced a template. Unruly female sexuality would be brought before the nation and publicly corrected.
The immediate effect was to humiliate the victim and to signal to every woman at court the price of falling from royal favor. But the deeper function was political theater. A sexualized public shaming answers a political problem more efficiently than a private arrest. It mobilizes popular emotion, erases nuance, and frames the condemned as morally tainted in the public imagination. That stigma is often more permanent than the legal outcome. In Anne's case, the staged humiliation also served to validate, at least for the moment, the fabricated sexual charges used to justify her removal. The spectacle was both punishment and preemptive narrative, designed to make the accusations stick beyond the courtroom. Crime 3. Weaponizing the body and lineage. The third crime is the instrumental use of lineage and the female body as a means of controlling succession. This is less about a single act and more about the logic that made sexual accusation an effective assault on dynastic legitimacy. By alleging that a queen had violated sexual norms, the regime could argue that any child she bore was tainted, an argument with catastrophic legal and personal consequences for heirs and for maternal identity alike. The anecdote here is Anne's daughter. Elizabeth, still a child, found her status suddenly precarious. The queen's fall meant an immediate administrative response. Households dissolved, attendants dispersed, and the child's public position shifted. The court moved quickly to manage the optics of succession. If the mother's sexual character could be questioned, the child's claim to royal blood could be undermined. To weaponize the maternal body in this way is to subordinate motherhood to political utility. The female reproductive role becomes a vector for suspicion rather than a protected legal interest. Procedural details show the deliberation behind this strategy. Anne's household was stripped of its privileges. Her daughter's household was reduced. Portraits and public images that could serve as proof of legitimate motherhood were removed or destroyed. The king's remarriage to Jane Seymour shortly after Anne's death reinforced the message. Replacement could be rapid, and lineage could be recalibrated to fit dynastic needs. The victor's narrative rewrites biological and social bonds as easily as law. The consequence reached beyond a single child. It altered how royal women could protect their offspring's claims. Mothers became political liabilities under the threat that sexual accusations could delegitimize their bloodlines. The system thus destabilized maternal authority and placed the female body squarely within the machinery of succession politics. In the long term, it cultivated a court culture that viewed women's sexuality primarily as a political variable, to be policed, shamed, and, if necessary, removed. Crime 4. Physical desecration as sexualized degradation. There's a difference between execution and display. The fourth crime is the treatment of the body after death as an instrument of degradation, a deliberate physical erasure intended to sexualize and objectify the deceased. Anne's body, or at least parts of it, were treated as objects in a public narrative, displayed, packaged in ignoble containers, removed from the dignity of burial. That handling speaks to an intention to ensure that the memory of the person would be framed not as a queen, but as a stained sexual subject. The transcript's details are stark. There was no ornate coffin bearing royal emblems. Instead, the head was placed in an arrow chest, a box associated with military spoils and common use, rather than a royal reliquary. Portraits were hidden or destroyed. Public monuments and images that could rehabilitate a reputation were purged. The visual record was altered so that future generations would encounter a curated story, the queen who fell from grace. Who orchestrated such physical desecration? The administrative hands of the court, under instruction, controlled the handling and the narrative after death. The choice of container for the head, the limited access to burial rites, and the hasty suppression of commemorative artifacts all point to a calculated campaign to make the body part of the punishment. The practice amounts to a form of sexualized objectification, the person reduced to a fragment of evidence to support the accusation, the body made into proof. Consequences ripple outward. When a state can control the dead, it controls memory. The erasure of honorifics and the destruction of images prevented sympathetic reinterpretations. It ensured that any counter-narrative would have to contend not just with accusers still alive, but with the physical absence of the honored forms that memory relies on. For the family and for Princess Elizabeth, this meant the loss of visual anchors that might assert legitimacy, sympathy, or martyrdom. The state's control over the physical remnants of a life thus became a decisive weapon in sinking reputation. Crime 5. Psychological sexual torture via interrogation and isolation. If the first crime manufactured sexual offense and the second staged public degradation, the fifth and final crime happens in private, the prolonged psychological assault that used sexual shame to break a person's identity. Interrogation techniques, isolation, forced confessions, and the relentless spread of sexual rumor all combined to create a campaign of mental degradation with explicit sexual contours. The procedural details here are chilling. Extended confinement in the tower, moved between cells, sleep deprivation through repeated summons and rescheduling, and the use of friends and servants as sources of testimony under pressure. Witnesses were coerced to speak. Witnesses who refused faced their own peril. The regime did not merely extract a confession to satisfy a judge.
It sought to collapse the accused identity, particularly the identity of a woman who embodied both political value and sexual autonomy, into a series of shameful accusations. The sexualized nature of this mental torture is significant. Rumor campaigns exaggerated or invented sexual details that could not be disproved inside a cell. The accused's reputation was attacked on the same axis that defined much of female worth in court: sexual behavior. By attacking that axis, the state aimed to dismantle not just social standing, but the person's sense of self. For someone whose power and identity were wrapped up in the roles of queen and mother, the assault on sexual reputation was an assault on existence. Consequences here extended beyond the individual. The terror of such methods had a chilling effect on courtiers and on women in positions of influence. The message sent was clear. The state could, if necessary, grind a person down through prolonged uncertainty and public rumor until they were psychologically broken and publicly humiliated. The ripple effect was obedience. The longer the tactic persisted, the more effective it became at discouraging dissent. Synthesis: the system and its purpose. Taken together, these 5 crimes form a coherent strategy. Fabricated accusations provided legal pretext. Sexualized public spectacle delivered moral condemnation to the masses. The weaponization of body and lineage targeted succession. The physical desecration sealed erasure. And the psychological torture ensured confession, compliance, or silence. Each method amplified the others, creating a system that was efficient, scalable, and ruthlessly effective. The target was not just Anne Boleyn as an individual. The target was the idea that a woman might stand between the king and a male heir, that a queen might command a public affection or political influence potent enough to threaten the crown's immediate plans. Reduce the woman's sexual reputation, stage her humiliation, control the afterlife of her image, and the path to replacement clears. Jane Seymour's rapid elevation after Anne's fall demonstrates the method's efficacy. Replacement without prolonged contestation, narrative switched, lineage secured. Why did England, and those who curated its chronicles, so quickly move to a sanitized version of events? The mechanisms of denial are obvious and institutional. Poets and chroniclers were enlisted or incentivized to rewrite public memory. Portraits that might have reminded people of Anne's presence were hidden or altered. The crown's swift remarriage offered a new story to hold public attention. The state's power to control both spectacle and routine meant that the embarrassing or morally complicated parts of a reign could be excised, recast, or explained away as necessary acts of governance rather than crimes. There is also a cultural discomfort at admitting that royal power was used in such carnal and intimate ways.
Accepting the full indictment means acknowledging that sex and shame were not mere byproducts of political contest, but primary instruments. That admission unsettles nationalist myths about a dignified monarchy and complicates celebratory accounts of Tudor stability. The temptation, therefore, has been to treat Anne's fall as scandalous but exceptional, an unfortunate episode in an otherwise legitimate rule, rather than as the exemplar of a systematic tool set for eliminating political rivals. Why England still won't fully admit it. Institutional memory is a political choice. The Crown's archives, the sanctioned histories, the curated art collections, all of them serve the practical purpose of maintaining continuity. To label the events for what they were, an orchestrated campaign of sexualized criminalization and humiliation, would destabilize those narratives and invite deeper scrutiny into similar episodes. It would force a reevaluation of how many other reputations were constructed or dismantled under similar methods. There is also the matter of precedent. If such methods were acknowledged as crimes, what would that say about the legal innovations and governance structures of the Tudor state? The admission would demand legal and moral reckoning, and institutions dislike debt collectors. The sanitization, poets rewriting a queen's image, quick remarriage to soothe the realm, removal of portraits and relics, was an entirely practical strategy to avoid long-term liability, public sympathy for the condemned, and a crisis of succession narrative. Finally, social attitudes about gender and sexuality play a role. The public appetite for tales of fallen women feeds a culture that is less inclined to look at power and more inclined to gossip about sex. Admitting that the state weaponized those appetites threatens a long tradition of treating sexual scandal as personal failing rather than political crime. That cultural unwillingness to interrogate the erotic mechanics of power allows denial to persist. A closing image and a question. Picture one image to hold these 5 crimes together. The head placed in the arrow chest. It is both a literal and symbolic act. Literal because it is the physical method of hiding a trace. Symbolic because it shows how the state took the most intimate parts of a person, her body, her reputation, her motherhood, and boxed them away, consigning them to a storage of war rather than to a place of honor. What does it mean for a nation to hide its inconvenient dead in this way? How many reputations were boxed away so that new ones could be built on top without dissent? These are not abstract questions. They're invitations to look at how power uses sex as a blunt instrument and how public memory can be curated to serve the present. If this troubled you, help others see how history was rewritten. Like, subscribe, and share.
Reflect on the ways sexual rumor and spectacle still serve power today, and ask who in our own time is being silenced behind a different kind of arrow chest.